Hernán Cortés wrote a letter to the King of Spain in 1522. In it, he described the conquest of Tenochtitlan in detail. He listed the gold seized. He listed the territory claimed. He listed the soldiers who died in battle. What he did not list were the names of the Aztec noblewomen, his men kept as slaves after the city fell. Women from the royal family, women from noble houses, women who had lived in palaces and worn jade and gold, women who became property of Spanish soldiers who could barely read. We know these women existed because other conquistadors wrote about them. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier who fought with Cortés, mentions them in his memoir 50 years later. He names some of them, he describes what happened to them, and then he writes this line, "I will not recount all that was done to them, for some things are best left unwritten." Best left unwritten. That phrase appears in multiple Spanish sources from the conquest. Always about the noblewomen, always vague, always followed by silence. This video breaks that silence. This is what Spanish conquistadors did to Aztec noblewomen after Tenochtitlan fell on the 13th of August 1521, and why not a single conquistador was ever punished. Before we can understand what happened to these women, you need to understand who they were. Aztec noblewomen were not powerless. They were not hidden away in harems. They were educated. They were politically active. They owned property. Some governed cities. The most powerful noblewomen in the Aztec Empire came from the royal families of the Triple Alliance, the political union of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan that controlled central Mexico. These women married into other royal families to seal alliances. They managed estates. They participated in religious ceremonies. They were literate in the Aztec pictographic writing system. They commanded servants. They wore clothing so elaborate it took hours to put on. They were the elite of the most powerful empire in the Americas. The most famous of these noblewomen was a woman the Spanish called Doña Marina. Her Aztec name was Malintzin. She was born into nobility, enslaved as a child after a family dispute, and given to Cortés as a translator when he arrived in 1519. Malintzin spoke Nahuatl and Mayan. She learned Spanish within months. She became Cortés's translator, advisor, and eventually his mistress. She bore him a son. The Spanish treated her as an exception, a Christian convert, a woman who helped them. But to the Aztecs, she was a traitor. To history, she is a symbol of colonization itself. Curiosity loop. But Malintzin was one woman who gained power through collaboration. The other noblewomen, the ones who remained loyal to the Aztec Empire, had a very different fate. And what happened to them reveals the truth about conquest that the Spanish chronicles tried to bury. Tenochtitlan, in 1521, was a city of 200,000 people, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. It had canals instead of streets. It had floating gardens called chinampas that fed the population. It had pyramids that towered over the lake. It had markets where 60,000 people traded every day. It had aqueducts bringing fresh water from the mainland. The Spanish, who first saw it in 1519, compared it to Venice. Some said it was more beautiful than any city in Europe. For 2 years, Cortés tried to conquer it. He made alliances with the Aztec Empire's enemies. He laid siege to the city. He cut off food and water. He bombarded it with cannons. And on the 13th of August 1521, after 93 days of siege, Tenochtitlan fell. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, surrendered to Cortés. The Spanish entered the city and found a nightmare. Tens of thousands of Aztec civilians had died during the siege from starvation, disease, and Spanish attacks. The streets were filled with bodies. The canals were choked with corpses. The smell was unbearable. The city that had been the jewel of the Americas was a ruin. And in that ruin, Spanish soldiers began looting everything they could find. Gold, jade, feathers, textiles, food, weapons, and women. Curiosity loop. The Spanish had rules about warfare. They had laws about how to treat conquered populations. They had priests traveling with the army to ensure soldiers behaved according to Christian morality. And yet, what happened in Tenochtitlan after the surrender violated every one of those rules. The question is, why? And the answer tells you everything about how colonization actually worked. Phase 1, the first week, the branding of the noblewomen. The Spanish did not immediately massacre the population of Tenochtitlan. Cortés needed the city intact. He needed the Aztec nobility to cooperate in governing the survivors. He needed translators, administrators, intermediaries, so he offered terms. Aztec nobles who converted to Christianity and swore loyalty to Spain would be allowed to keep some of their property and status. Many accepted. They had no choice. Resistance meant death. Cooperation meant maybe, possibly, survival. But there was a condition. All Aztec property now belonged to the Spanish crown. That included people. Every Aztec in the city was considered a potential slave until they could prove they were free Christians. To enforce this, Cortés ordered a registration. Every Aztec was required to appear before Spanish officials and declare their status. Those who could not prove they were free were branded, literally branded with a hot iron. The brand was the letter G for guerra, war. It marked them as war captives, legal slaves under Spanish law. The noblewomen were supposed to be exempt from this. Aztec noble families had negotiated their surrender with the understanding that noblewomen would be protected. But the Spanish soldiers did not care about negotiations. They cared about loot. And noblewomen, especially young ones, were valuable. They could be sold. They could be kept as servants. They could be used and then discarded. Within the first week of occupation, Spanish soldiers began rounding up noblewomen from the houses where they had taken shelter. The women were brought to a central plaza. They were forced to strip, and they were branded on the face. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, the soldier whose memoir is one of our primary sources, describes this scene. He writes that many of the women were of good family and well-dressed when they were taken. He writes that some had children with them. He writes that the branding was done publicly, in full view of the Aztec men who had surrendered and were now forced to watch. The purpose was not just to mark the women as slaves. The purpose was to humiliate the Aztec nobility, to show them that their women, their families, their honor meant nothing to the Spanish, that everything they had valued was now Spanish property. Phase 2, the division, how the Spanish distributed the noblewomen. After the branding, the women were divided. Cortés took his share first. As commander, he claimed the most valuable captives. He chose women from the royal family. Women who were related to Moctezuma, the previous emperor. Women who had political value. Some he kept as servants. Some he gave as gifts to Spanish nobles back in Spain. Some he used as translators and intermediaries to help govern the conquered territory. Cortés justified this by saying he was civilizing them, converting them to Christianity, saving their souls. Pattern interrupt. 8. Stop for a second and think about what this meant in practice. Imagine you are a 20-year-old Aztec noblewoman. A week ago, you lived in a palace. You had servants. You wore gold. You participated in state ceremonies. You were educated, literate, powerful. Then your city fell. You watched your family die in the siege. You surrendered believing you would be protected. And now you are standing in a plaza, naked, branded on the face like cattle, while Spanish men argue over who gets to own you. This was not a metaphor. This was legal. This was policy. This was conquest. The ranking soldiers chose next. Captains and lieutenants got the next tier of noblewomen. These women were given to soldiers as rewards for service. Some soldiers kept them as concubines. Some sold them immediately to other conquistadors. Some put them to work as domestic servants. The Spanish justified this by calling it encomienda, a legal system where Spanish colonists were entrusted with groups of indigenous people to Christianize and protect. In practice, encomienda was slavery. The Spanish could force the people under their encomienda to work without pay, to provide tribute, to obey any order. And the noblewomen distributed this way had no legal recourse. They could not appeal. They could not leave. They were property. The regular soldiers got what was left. Lower-ranking conquistadors, men who had no wealth or status in Spain, suddenly owned Aztec noblewomen. And this is where the sources become vague. Curiosity loop. Diaz mentions that many of these women were treated poorly and that some died from the treatment they received. He does not elaborate. Other Spanish sources use euphemisms. They say the women were used for labor. They say the women suffered indignities. They say the women were not treated as Christians should be. What they mean is rape. What they mean is forced labor. What they mean is that noblewomen who had lived in palaces were now washing clothes, cooking food, and serving Spanish soldiers who saw them as less than human. Phase 3. The children. The next generation. Within a year of Tenochtitlan's fall, many of the enslaved noblewomen were pregnant. Some had been raped by their Spanish owners. Some had been forced into concubinage. Some had formed relationships with soldiers out of survival strategy, believing that bearing a conquistador's child might offer protection. The children born from these unions were called mestizos, mixed race. They were Spanish by law if their father acknowledged them. They were indigenous if he did not. Most conquistadors did not acknowledge their mestizo children. Most treated them as indigenous and therefore subject to the same systems of exploitation as their mothers. But some did acknowledge them. Cortés acknowledged his son with Malintzin and named him Martín. He sent the boy to Spain to be educated as a Spanish nobleman. Other high-ranking conquistadors did the same with their mestizo children by noblewomen. This created a new class in colonial Mexico, mixed-race elites who were Spanish in culture but indigenous in blood. Pattern interrupt. 13. And here is the twisted logic of it. The same conquistadors who raped and enslaved Aztec noblewomen then raised their children as Spanish. They destroyed the mothers and elevated the sons. They erased indigenous identity in one generation by literally breeding it out. The Aztec noblewomen who bore these children had no say in any of this. If they kept the child, they were servants, raising their owner's heir. If the child was taken from them, they lost the only connection they had left. Some sources suggest that noblewomen who bore children were treated slightly better by their Spanish owners, given lighter work, allowed to keep the child as long as they remained obedient. But this was not kindness, this was breeding. The Spanish were creating a generation of people who would be culturally Spanish but had Aztec blood, people who could serve as intermediaries, translators, administrators in the new colonial system, people who would help Spain govern a conquered population. So what exactly did Spanish conquistadors do to Aztec noblewomen after Tenochtitlan fell? The historical record, when you read between the euphemisms, tells us this. They branded them on the face. They distributed them as property. They raped them. They forced them to work as domestic servants and field laborers. They impregnated them and took the children. They sold them to other conquistadors when they were no longer useful. They worked them until they died and replaced them with other enslaved indigenous women. They treated women who had been nobles in the Aztec Empire as less than the livestock they brought from Spain. And it was legal. Every single action was justified under Spanish colonial law. The branding was legal because the women were classified as war captives. The distribution was legal under encomienda. The forced labor was legal because indigenous people owed tribute to their encomenderos. The sexual violence was not prosecuted because Spanish law did not recognize rape of an enslaved indigenous woman as a crime. A Spanish man could rape an indigenous woman under his encomienda and face no consequences because she was his property and he could do with his property as he wished. Curiosity loop. But here is the part that should make you furious. The Spanish knew this was wrong. They debated it. The Catholic Church debated it. Spanish legal scholars debated it. In 1512, before Cortés even reached Mexico, Spain had passed the laws of Burgos, which theoretically protected indigenous people from the worst abuses of encomienda. The laws said indigenous people were free vassals of the Spanish crown, not slaves. The laws said they should be paid for their labor. The laws said they should be Christianized gently, not forced. And absolutely none of this was enforced in Mexico. None. Cortés ignored it. His soldiers ignored it. The priests, traveling with the army, ignored it. And when reports of abuses reached Spain, the crown did nothing. Why? Because the Spanish crown was getting rich from the conquest of Mexico. The gold flowing back to Spain from Tenochtitlan was funding Spanish wars in Europe. King Charles V was becoming the most powerful monarch in Europe on the back of Aztec wealth. He was not going to prosecute the men who were making him rich. So the abuses continued. The noblewomen continued to be enslaved. Their children continued to be taken. And the legal framework that made it all possible continued to exist for 300 years until Mexican independence in 1821. Not a single Spanish conquistador was ever punished for what was done to the Aztec noblewomen. Not one. Cortés died wealthy and honored in Spain. His soldiers received estates and titles. The men who branded noblewomen on the face, who raped them, who enslaved them, who worked them to death, retired as landowners in New Spain. Some of their descendants still own the land today. The families that built their wealth on the backs of enslaved Aztec women are still prominent in Mexico. The injustice was never corrected. The crimes were never prosecuted. The women were never freed. They died as slaves and were buried in unmarked graves or not buried at all. The Aztec noblewomen who survived the first years of Spanish occupation faced a choice: resist and die, or adapt and maybe survive. Some resisted, some refused to convert to Christianity. Some tried to escape. Most were caught and punished. Punishment for an enslaved indigenous woman attempting to escape could be whipping, branding a second time, or execution. Some adapted. Some converted to Christianity, learned Spanish, took Spanish names, and tried to navigate the new colonial system. Some formed relationships with their Spanish owners, hoping to gain protection. Some bore children and raised them as Spanish, erasing their own heritage to give their children a chance at survival. Pattern interrupt 20. And here is the part that makes this story more complicated than simple victimization. Some Aztec noblewomen became powerful in the colonial system. Malintzín's son Martín became a Spanish nobleman. Other mestizo children of noblewomen rose to positions of wealth and influence. Some noblewomen who converted and collaborated with the Spanish received property and status. The Spanish colonial system did not offer equality, but it offered survival to those willing to erase their identity and serve the colonizers. Some women took that deal because the alternative was death. But for every woman who survived by adapting, dozens more died as slaves, died from overwork, died from disease brought by the Spanish, died in childbirth, died from malnutrition, died from despair. The indigenous population of central Mexico before the conquest was between 15 and 25 million people. By 1600, it was 1 million. That is a 95% population collapse in 80 years. Disease was the primary killer, smallpox and measles brought by the Spanish that the indigenous population had no immunity to. But slavery, overwork, malnutrition, and violence killed millions more. The Aztec noblewomen who were enslaved in 1521 were part of that collapse. Most of them did not live long enough to see 1,530. The Spanish eventually reformed the encomienda system, not because they suddenly developed a conscience, but because they realized they were killing off their labor force. In 1542, Spain passed the new laws, which officially banned enslaving indigenous people and reformed encomienda. But by then, the damage was done. An entire generation of Aztec nobles had been destroyed. The women who survived were already broken, already colonized, already raising mestizo children who would grow up Spanish. The new laws were not justice. They were not reparations. They were not an apology. They were just the Spanish crown protecting its economic interests. So why does this story matter now, 500 years later? Because the systems created in 1521 still exist. The racial hierarchies that place Spanish at the top and indigenous at the bottom still shape Latin American societies today. The descendants of the conquistadors still own the land. The descendants of the enslaved still work it. The legal frameworks that made conquest possible evolved into the legal frameworks that govern modern nation-states. And the silence around what was done to indigenous women, the euphemisms, the vague language, the some things are best left unwritten, that silence continues. History textbooks still talk about the conquest of Mexico as an inevitable clash of civilizations. They talk about Cortés as a brilliant military strategist. They talk about the fall of Tenochtitlan as the beginning of the modern Americas. What they do not talk about is the women, the noble women who were branded, the women who were raped, the women who bore children they could not keep, the women who died as slaves building the colonial system that became modern Mexico. The Aztec noblewomen of 1,521 deserve to be remembered, not just as victims, not just as statistics in the population collapse, but as real people who had names and families and lives that were stolen from them. We know some of their names. Tenochtitlan, daughter of Moctezuma, who was married 4 times to Spanish conquistadors and bore children she did not choose. Tlapalis-Quixotzin, a noblewoman from Tlatelolco, who was enslaved and whose descendants later fought for indigenous rights in colonial courts. Atotostli, a princess of Texcoco, who was given to a Spanish captain and disappeared from the historical record entirely. These are the names that survive. There were thousands more whose names are lost. If you want more stories like this, stories about the parts of history that get erased from textbooks, subscribe. I post a new one every week. And if you think the Spanish conquest was brutal, wait until you hear what Roman Emperor Commodus did to Vestal virgins inside the Colosseum. That video is next. The Roman sources tried to hide it for centuries. I found them,